Hello everyone, welcome to another Blender Made Easy tutorial. Today we're going to be breaking some wine bottles in Blender. I'm going to be showing you exactly how to break up the bottle and how to add the fluid simulation. Let's go ahead and get started by deleting the default cube, and then we're going to add in a wine bottle. The link is in the description if you want to download the one that I've created. Once you have it downloaded, you can go over to File, down to Append, and then navigate to where the blend file is. Select it, go over to Collection, select the glass bottle collection, and then append it into your scene. Let's go into front view and place this over in the spot that we're going to start animating it, and we're going to place it somewhere around here, about 2 grid units to the right and 3 grid units up. Now let's add in a wall for the bottle to actually collide with. I'll press Shift A, add in a plane, and we'll scale this plane up pretty big, somewhere around here. Then we'll go into edit mode, and then we'll select this edge on the left side. Select both the edges and then extrude it upwards. Somewhere around there will look pretty good. Now let's go ahead and animate the bottle going over to the left. I'm going to go back into front view and select it. I'm going to hit I and add in a location rotation keyframe on frame 1. Then we're going to jump to frame 30, drag this over to the left, rotate it something like this, and place it right about there. I think will be good, right next to the wall. And then I'm going to hit I and add in another location rotation keyframe. So this is what it looks like so far. The next thing we need to do is make sure the interpolation between these two keyframes is set to linear, because at the moment it's set to a curve, which smooths out the animation, as you can see. So make sure both of those keyframes are selected, hit T and choose linear. Now the interpolation is a straight line, which means it's going to move at a constant rate throughout the entire animation without slowing down or speeding up. Now what we need to do is create the pieces that the bottle is going to break into. To do this, we're going to Shift D this object, then right click, and then we're going to move it to its own collection. So click on New Collection and then hit OK. I pressed M to bring up that menu. We're going to go to that collection by hitting 2 on our keyboard, and then we're going to break this up into a couple of pieces. And to do this, we'll be using the Cell Fracture add-on. To enable this add-on, go over to your preferences right here, and then go underneath the add-ons tab and type in the word cell. You should see the Cell Fracture add-on. Make sure that's enabled and you'll be good to go. At the moment, if we were to apply the Cell Fracture add-on, it would actually fill the entire bottle over here, which is not what we want. We want it to just be pieces of the bottle. So to fix that, we need to add in some thickness to it. We're going to go over to the Modifier tab, click Add Modifier, and select Solidify, and then just apply this modifier. Now we can see the bottle has some thickness, which is perfect. Now let's destroy this bottle. To do this, we're going to press F3 to bring up the search menu and type in the word cell, and you should see the Cell Fracture add-on, and then select it right there. Here we have a bunch of different settings which controls how the object will be broken up. The source limit is how many pieces the object is going to be broken up into. I'm going to set this down to 75. The noise amount controls how random the pieces are. With it set to 0, you're going to get more of a boxy, very straight looking pieces. But if we drag this up to, let's say 1, the pieces are going to be a lot more random. And the recursion is how many levels it'll break the pieces into. If it's set to 0, all of them will just be pretty big. But if you set it up to 1, some of the pieces on this object will also be broken up. So that's what we're going to do. This will create smaller pieces. Set that up to 1, and then you can click OK. And you can see here is the effect. If we hide the original bottle now, all of the pieces look like that, and it is looking pretty good. If this happens where you get this piece right here where it's just an extra bit of geometry and you can move it around, you can just delete that piece. We don't really need that. Now we also don't need the original bottle, so select bottle 001 and then delete it. Now what we need to do, since we're going to apply a rigid body to all of these pieces, we need to make sure they're scaled down just slightly so they don't explode. If they're touching right here and the rigid body plays, it's just going to blow up everything. So let's select everything by hitting A and switching this over to individual origins so it scales them individually. Then we'll press S to scale and just do it just slightly so all of the edges are not touching each other. Something like that is perfect. Now what we need to do is parent all of these pieces to the original bottle. So what I'll do is I'll hold Shift and 1 to bring back layer 1, and then I will right click, select all of the objects in collection 2, and then if you hold Control, you can select the original bottle. This is the active object. Now we can parent it. I'm going to press Control P and then click on Object. Now all of the pieces are going to follow the exact pattern as the original bottle, which is what we want. Now let's go ahead and add in the rigid body simulation. Let's select one of the pieces right here and then go over to the physics panel. Let's click on rigid body and then we're going to leave the type on active. If we play our simulation, you're going to notice the piece just falls down and it doesn't follow this object. So what we need to do instead is turn on animated. Now this piece is going to follow the bottle as you can see here. But then once it reaches frame 30, it still doesn't move. So we need to turn off this animation checkbox once it hits frame 30. To do this, we're going to go to the left on frame 29, add in a keyframe under animated, then go to the next frame, frame 30, uncheck this, and then add in another keyframe. Now this is the result that we get. As you can see there, that looks pretty cool. Let's go ahead and select the plane and add in a rigid body to this as well. Click on rigid body, set it over to passive, and then make sure the shape is set to mesh and not convex hull. Convex hull is going to make a wrap around the entire object, and that's going to be the collision boundary. So this entire thing in the middle is going to be a collision, which is not what we want. We need to make sure it's set to mesh so it actually does the correct shape. Now let's go ahead and apply the rigid body to the rest of the objects. I'm going to select this collection, right click and go select objects, and then holding control I will select the top one right there which has the rigid body right here. Underneath the sensitivity I'm also going to turn on collision margin. Let's go with a value of 0.001 and enter, just so it doesn't collide with any of the other pieces. Then what we can do is go over to object, down to rigid body, and then click on copy from active. Now every single piece should have that rigid body applied, but as you can see it doesn't apply the animation under the animated checkbox. And to do that we need to do this one more time, right click, select all the objects, holding control I will select the object with the animation, then I'm going to hit Control L and click on link animation data. Now every single one of these will have that exact animation data right there. Now if we play our animation, here is the result that we get. One more thing I'm going to do is select the plane, and then underneath the surface responses, I'm just going to bring up the friction just a little bit so the pieces don't slide around so much. The cool thing about linking the animation data is if we were to select the keyframes for the animation and then move it over to frame 50, it's going to apply that same change to the rest of the objects as you can see there. So that's very useful and it's very easy to change your animation when you link all of the pieces. Now that we've set this up, let's bake it in. I'm going to go over to the scene panel and then underneath the rigid body world, we're going to set the speed a little bit lower too. Because I want this to be a slow motion animation, I'm going to set the speed down to 0.2. One thing to note is when you change the speed, it's also going to change how the simulation looks. For example, if we set this up to 1 and we play our animation, you're going to see all the pieces kind of just fall right here. But if we drag this lower, let's say 0.2, it's going to change how the physics work in the simulation. You can see a lot of the other pieces are now falling over this way. They're moving across the plane as you can see, and it changes the simulation. So keep that in mind whenever you change the speed, it also affects the physics of your animation. With that done, we're going to open up the cache panel and set the end frame to 200 and then click on bake. As you can see, this baked very quickly, and we're going to set this down to a value of 200 as well. Now let's create the fluid. But first, if you want to learn more about the fluid simulation or the rigid body simulation for that matter, I've created a class on both of those topics over on Skillshare. In these classes, we go into depth on all of the settings and we learn exactly how to use these simulations efficiently. Plus, there's a couple of projects as well. And Skillshare is the sponsor of this video. What is Skillshare, you might ask? It's an online learning platform where you can basically learn anything you want, including Blender. There's one class that I can recommend and it's called Your First Geometry Nodes Project by Bad Normals. We all know geometry nodes are pretty complex and hard to understand sometimes, and this class was a great introduction of how to use this really complex system, and you get to create something really cool in the process. So if you're wanting to learn more about the fluid simulation, the rigid body, geometry nodes, or one of the thousands of classes that Skillshare provides, you are in luck because Skillshare has given me a special link that I'm going to give to all of you guys. The first 1,000 people to go in the description and click this link will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. which means you have access to every single class on their platform and you can learn as much as you want. So what are you waiting for? Click the link in the description and start learning something new today. Thanks again to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to the tutorial. Now that the rigid body simulation is done, we can set up the fluid simulation. We need to first add in another cube object, scale this up, and this is going to be the domain. I'm going to go into top view and make sure it fits the entire plane, just like this. Next up, we're going to go over to the physics tab, click on fluid, and set the type over to domain. For the domain type, we're going to select liquid. And also make sure you press Ctrl A and apply the scale to your domain so it actually works correctly. We're going to skip to frame 30, and how this is going to work is we're going to place the flow object right at frame 30 in this position. If we were to try to animate the fluid inside this bottle when it's moving, that's just not going to work. And the reason for that is just because Mantaflow is not the best fluid simulator. You're going to have so much trouble keeping the fluid inside this when it's moving. So holding shift, we can place our cursor there and then add in a cylinder. Rotate this cylinder and place it right inside this bottle. With it inside the bottle, we're going to select fluid and set the type over to flow, and then for the flow type, choose liquid. We also want to make sure this has some momentum going over to the left, so underneath the initial velocity, make sure that's turned on. Underneath the X, we're going to go -40, and then underneath the Z, we're going to go -3. So it's going to shoot out and end up right around here, and it's going to follow the same velocity as all of the pieces. One very important thing is make sure you press Ctrl A and apply the rotation and the scale of this object as well. The other thing that you could do if you wanted is that you could add a collision to all of the pieces, and I'll show you real quick how to do that. You just select fluid, set the type over to effector, and then make sure you set the surface thickness to 0.1. And then if you select all of the objects and press Ctrl L, you can click on copy modifiers. That's going to apply the effector to all of the pieces. The problem with this though is that it's really going to slow down the simulation, and the baking is going to take twice, maybe 3 times as long. The other issue when you add in collision for the fluid is that the collision will hit the fluid and then shoot it in the direction of the plane, which causes some weird physics, and it shoots out when the bottle hasn't fully been broken yet. But instead, we're just going to bake it in with a high velocity so it looks like it still has collision. So with that done, we're going to go over to the domain settings. We're going to scroll down to the cache and set the type over to modular, and then turn on is resumable. If you also want to add motion blur to your fluid, you can change the format volume to unicache. This will allow us to bake in the use speed vectors in the mesh, and then we can add that in the compositor later in this tutorial. With that done, we're going to scroll up to the resolution divisions and bring this up to 192. If you have a slower computer, I recommend setting this lower, probably around 128, but if your computer can handle it, you can go 192. I'm also going to turn off the right collision so the fluid doesn't build up in the domain, rather it spreads across and then disappears on this right side. I'm also going to bring down the particle radius. This value controls the radius around each particle. If your fluid simulation looks like it's gaining volume when it plays, you're going to want to turn this down. If it's losing volume, you're going to want to turn it up. This simulation, I've noticed, gains a lot of volume when we play it, so we need to bring this down to counteract that. Let's go with a value of 0.915. Then we're going to turn on mesh and then leave the upres factor at a value of 2, and then the particle radius, which is the radius of mesh around each particle, we're going to go lower so we have a sharper looking mesh. Let's go with a value of 1.2. Then of course, use speed vectors, we're going to enable that. Before we bake this in, we need to make sure that we set the start frame to match when the bottle reaches this point, which is frame 30. So over in the start frame, we're going to set this to 30. And then for the end frame, we're also going to match it by setting it down to 200. And then one last thing before we bake this in is we need to scroll up to the time scale. And remember, we changed the speed of the rigid body to 0.2. We're going to match that by changing this speed down to 0.2 as well. Make sure you save your project before you bake it and then click on Bake Data. Here's the simulation so far. As you can see, it does look pretty good. The fluid hits this and spreads all over the domain, which is pretty cool. Next up, we're going to scroll down over to the mesh settings and make sure everything is good, and then click on Bake Mesh. We can see if we go into render view and we play our animation that the cube is visible until frame 30. The reason for this is because the fluid simulation starts at frame 30, and so the first 30 frames there's nothing baked. So what we need to do is hide the domain until frame 30. To do this, we're going to restart the animation, and I'm going to select both the cylinder and the domain and then press M and move them to collection 1. Then on frame 29, we're going to uncheck the camera icon underneath the cube, which is the domain, and then add in a keyframe by hitting I while hovering over that. We're going to go to the next frame when it is visible, turn it back on, and then add in another keyframe. So it's going to be not visible until frame 30, and then the fluid simulation is going to play, and here is the result that we get. As you can see, it does look pretty cool. The other thing that we need to do is the exact opposite for the original bottle. Also, we don't need to see the flow object, so hide it from the view and hide it from the render. As for the original bottle, we need to do that same thing. So on frame 29, we're going to press I while hovering over it with it visible. We're going to go to the next frame, frame 30, uncheck this, and then hit I one more time. So the original bottle disappears. With that done, we are ready to set up the material for the fluid. Select your domain object, and we're going to give it a new material. This surface, we're going to switch it over to a glass shader. We're going to bring the roughness down to 0, and then for the color, we're going to go with a nice reddish color. And if you want to use the same one I'm going to use, it's this one right here, D47C7B. That gives us this color. We're also going to add in a little bit of volume. So underneath the volume tab, we're going to select the principled volume shader. As for the color, select the exact color for the glass shader just like that, and then the density will drag up to 10. Here's what it looks like in the preview. As you can see, it's got this nice red color and it looks like wine, which is what we want. And that is basically it. From here you can set up the camera and the lighting and the material for the plane. I just used a very low roughness. And as for the lighting, I selected the lamp and I set the strength to around 4000. If you want to add a vector blur, I've created a tutorial on that already. You can click that in the top right. But if you want to learn how to do it, basically you have to enable both the Z and the vector pass. After that, I just added in some render settings. I made the background transparent and set the contrast to medium-high contrast. I set the samples to 100 and then I rendered out an image. Jump over to the compositor and you can add in the vector blur node and then connect the depth and the vector into the different sockets. Play around with the blur amount until you're happy with it, and then you can render out your animation. If you want to add in a background, just add in an alpha over node and then place it right here into the bottom socket. But there you go, that is how you create a glass bottle exploding in Blender. Thank you very much for watching, and if you learned something new, I would love to see what you create, so send it to me on Instagram at BlenderMadeEasy. Thanks again to Skillshare for sponsoring this video, and I will see you in the next one.